So, yeah, Dairy Australia obviously funded this, but we worked, we as in Queensland University of Technology, worked this with the Department of Primary Industries based out of Camden, and that was Warwick Doherty's group. So we basically had two major sites. Most of our research came out of northern New South Wales, with a few satellite sites in southern Queensland. And then we had the Camden core site on the old MacArthur research station there, and some satellite sites down around Bega and Taree. That's it, yes. And it was really great also to link in with local land services, particularly on the extension side of things. I haven't got Peter Beale mentioned here, but there's been a lot of correspondence between us and those guys as well. Oh, hi Peter, sorry. But as far as my team goes, that's me with my head in the dirt, which is pretty much where I spend most of my time. Johannes Friedel was the core postdoc there, so a lot of the more technical research, I suppose, is led by him. We had a few PhD students coming and visiting. Magella Mumford finished a few years ago. She was our main student. Various site interns who, without their help, our sites wouldn't run. And that includes sort of Michael down at Camden as well. And of course, some fantastic collaborative farmers that we've had to do with. And most of the time, we just follow them around asking them questions because they know a hell of a lot more than we do, particularly Wayne, just a wealth of knowledge and a great resource for us to be lucky enough to access. So around the objectives, like why are we answering this question? So this data is probably about a decade old now, but just looking at how we use nitrogen, particularly in the subtropical or New South Wales region, you can see there's a pretty fair difference between what the southerners are using around Gippsland and whatnot, and particularly what Dairy New South Wales are using as far as nitrogen. And so a lot of it's also about understanding the myths and like why the farmers are using the nitrogen what they are, and in this case not using the nitrogen. These are cow-based systems. You basically need to get the food to the cow, but if they're limited by the pasture growth, and that's the core aspects of the whole economic cycle of it, and certainly growing grass is the cheapest form of feed for these animals. And so we look at why the industry wants to know these things. There's a lot of uncertainty around, particularly applying surface urea, which is the main form of applied, and a lot of it's around just too wet to drive on, but also they're just worried about volatilisation losses or the losses that they're going to get. So a lot of it's just around understanding those. Actually get some numbers there. I won't go into the graphs on the left too much, but they're basically your standard NUE sort of by yield increases. So why do we care about nitrogen use efficiencies? I suppose in the dairy industry we have another reason, particularly in the subtropical dairy region, and that's around nitrates in plants as well. So this is actually some data that came out of with Bill Fulkerson out of Casino. And once we start to get a lot, particularly above that, these are leaf nitrate levels. Once we start to get above that red line there on the right-hand graph, we're getting into some pretty toxic territory. That's not only toxic for sort of fertility and things like that, but also it comes at a metabolic cost to the animal to be able to break that down. And so this, in this case, there is also too much of a good thing if we're putting on too much nitrogen. And some other more specific regional aims, I suppose. There's a lot of questions about East Coast lows. Dairy, I suppose, is a bit different from these other industries, is that we can put fertiliser on most of the year. We're not constrained by high crops or the reasons that other ones are. So there's a lot of questions about, well, if we have all this water in the soil, or if we have a lot of nitrogen in the soil, and we have a lot of water coming, first of all, does that nitrogen stay there, or how do we actually maximise our production from that? There's seasonal nitrogen production, so we've got two different growing seasons. We've got the ryegrass, which is the temperate species that grows over the winter, and the kikuyu, which is the C4 tropical species that grows over the summer. How do we change between those two seasons? And can we basically adjust the rate and the timing based on these seasonal conditions? And if that's so, if we do have EEFs that work, when is the best time to apply them and when are they economical? Distilling that down, basically around the 4 R's of fertiliser management, we came down with three main questions. How do we optimise nitrogen use efficiency in irrigated systems? And we're also using a bit of a broad brush there as well, is what happens under these really wet conditions that we get on the East Coast, when we can have East Coast lows that come down and dump hundreds of millimetres of rainfall. So how can we actually manage that nitrogen when our loss is occurring? And then one of the things we can adjust is the irrigation as well. Can we actually use irrigation as a tool? Once again, under those same conditions, what about nitrogen mineralisation? These are very high carbon pastures. You're looking 5-6%. So there's a lot of nitrogen floating around the system. And lastly, once again, how do we incorporate enhanced efficiency fertilisers? So we broke that down into a whole series of different experiments. Looked a lot of it around denitrification and basically when our losses are occurring, both as N2O and N2. And there was a lot of Johannes's work, basically quantifying in-field N2 emissions, which are by far the dominant form of nitrogen loss. And then also applying different irrigation frequencies. So where we apply the same amount of water, we're just aiming to replace evapotranspiration. So we don't want to deliberately saturate the soil, but break that up over different application intervals. So whether we put it on every 4 days, every 8 days, or every sort of 2 to 3 weeks. Urine, we've got to look. These big animals walking around their field, which excrete a lot of urine. Obviously, that has a major impact on our nitrogen cycle, and also the wetting and drying from our east coast lows. For mineralisation, we wanted to look at things over the long term. These are very dynamic systems, but actually we need to look at also what happens in the long term, particularly if we start to look at applying treatments around nitrogen rates and products. Are we just topping up that fast pool, or actually, is it affecting the long term stuff? We use a lot of 15N biomass recoveries and lab incubations. And then once again with the enhanced efficiency fertilisers, we also looked at long-term field studies. So we actually wanted to see how these enhanced efficiency fertilisers interacted with the soil organic nitrogen that's there. And because we've got this such big pool of nitrogen floating around already, we sort of, it's quite difficult to tease what's essentially a small saving out of a big pool. And then obviously we're combining that with urine. And we want to care about losses, but we also want to increase yields and look at the economic value of the EEFs as well. So key findings, these are just some photos of our two sites and some of the research infrastructure there. A lot of irrigation, rainfall exclusions, chambers for nitrous oxide and N2, and lots of 15N being applied to these sites. One of the main outcomes, I suppose, is we filled in a few blanks on this nitrogen schematic, particularly around the gaseous losses, about when and where they're occurring and how much. So we're looking at 5 to 10 kilos of nitrous oxide per year, 45 to 160 kilograms lost as N2. So that's a pretty significant chunk of nitrogen being lost. In our systems, at least, they're heavy clays, so they're not really leaching so much. I suppose that's a good thing as far as groundwater quality goes, but it's still an economic cost to the farmer. These are large input systems, 300 to 500 kilograms of nitrogen being put on as urea. Not so much going on as legumes. Volatilisation losses, we did actually measure this a little bit. We didn't actually see much of an impact at all, so we basically said they're minimal under normal application conditions, and the farmers have already got optimised, particularly in the irrigator systems, optimised things in place to reduce those losses. Surprisingly, we did a lot of stuff with urine, and the losses from that weren't as high as we expected, so you're only looking about 30 kg loss from an individual urine patch, and considering these are equivalent of 700 to 800 kilograms of nitrogen, that's actually not a lot. But I suppose the biggest thing that came out of this is really just, this is so interactive with the soil mineral nitrogen pool, and as I said, we're up to 5% carbon, 9 tonnes of nitrogen in the top 30 centimetres, and how all these fertiliser dynamics just can't really be disentangled from that in these systems. So just a bit of a summary on the losses. So this is from Casino, and basically, the longer our soils are saturated, the more nitrogen we lose, and we're basically losing most of that as N2. No surprise there. Once again, showing that in the field, I suppose it's not particularly easy to measure N2, but we can show that we lose a fair amount of nitrogen, up to sort of 5 kilos a day as N2. This is only after 40 kilograms of application. So a lot of our losses are driven by denitrification, and most of that denitrification is from N2. And this is really when that loss is happening. So I'm skipping ahead a bit here, but one of the core outcomes was, particularly with the irrigation stuff, was even though we're putting on substantial amounts of irrigation and wetting up the profile, we're putting on up to 90 millimetres. Our losses were quite small under irrigation, particularly compared to what we see in these East Coast low events. The top red lines there is just rainfall, and you can obviously see around November we had a pretty big rainfall event. And it's not so much the fact that the profile wets up, it's the fact that it wets up, dries down, wets up, dries down, wets up, dries down over the sort of week or 10 days with these East Coast lows come down. And that allows this pumping of the system. You have your mineralisation, you have your nitrification, you have your re-wetting of your profile, and you have your denitrification losing it. And then once the profile dries down again, that process can repeat. Under normal conditions with maximum plant uptake, good sunny days, you might have nitrate there and it's lost, but it's only going to be quite small because the plants are sucking up most of the nitrate that's in the profile. So we don't actually see a lot of denitrification losses under normal conditions because there's just not that much free nitrate in the profile. But once we start to get these pumping systems, these wetting and drying cycles, we got a lot of these mineralisation flushes which can produce a lot of nitrogen. And you can see on that bottom line there, where the red line is above the dotted line, that's when our soil's above saturation and it's dropping in and out of saturation, and that's basically what's causing this pumping. And in this case, we had 200 millimetres over 2 weeks, 5.5 kilos lost as nitrous oxide and 110 kilos lost as N2. So this is the mineralisation, and most of this losses are actually coming from the mineralisation pool. And we can also see basically it's driven by rainfall, it's driven by temperature, and we can get a fair bit of nitrogen mineralised over from these different soils. It does depend on the clay content and the soil type, but we're basically looking anywhere from 100 kilos in a duplex soil at Camden up to sort of 190 kilos on those vertisols at Casino that can basically mineralise a lot of carbon, nitrogen, which is roughly around 2% of the total soil nitrogen pool turned over annually. So this is talking about the right rate. So how do we actually account for that mineralisation? Because we know it's a lot, we know it's coming out over annually, but how do we actually adjust for that in our fertiliser regimes? So this is an experiment we did over 60 days. We applied 40 kilograms of nitrogen, and then we did 3 recoveries, full recoveries, plant and soil, and we basically traced that using 15N fertiliser, traced it through the different pools to basically see where our nitrogen is going and cycling. And we did that across the heavy black soil at Casino, which is a vertisol, and the duplex chromosol at Camden. And this is sort of the result here. So I won't go through all these sort of things, but you can see the greens are basically plant uptake over the different grazing intervals. Yellow ones are actually soil, so just to confuse things. So that basically brown wedge is what's basically in the soil. And you can see in the heavy clay at Casino, this is in kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, so after 40 kilos. So more than a third of that is basically sucked straight up into that, immobilised into the microbial biomass or into the organic pool. And then it doesn't actually change a lot over the subsequent grazing events. So even after 60 days, we're still seeing a fair chunk of that, about a third of that nitrogen still sitting in that organic pool. Compare that to Casino, to Camden, where it's a sandier duplex soil. We have a fair bit more still sitting in the soil at the beginning, but then that drops very rapidly after the second and third grazing event. And so the soil there, because it's lower clay content, lower organic matter, it's just the immobilisation there is much more reduced. And that sort of governs also how this reacts with the enhanced efficiency fertilisers. Basically what we see with the enhanced efficiency fertilisers, they work a lot more at Casino because that high amount of immobilisation, we're basically preventing that conversion from ammonium to nitrate, keeping it in the ammonium form for longer. That's allowing more immobilisation in the microbial pool and basically holding it on into the system a lot better. So we actually see quite a positive response to enhanced efficiency fertilisers there. Whereas at Camden, it's a much more dynamic system. When you put on fertiliser, you can see much more similar response, but we also see a much lower effect of the enhanced efficiency fertiliser because the immobilisation has much of a less impact. There's just less potential to immobilise the soil, the nitrogen in the Camden sandy soil. And if we actually look at the losses then of what we recovered, we actually see something similar represented there. So at Casino, even though it's a heavier clay soil, and this is under irrigation, and we're putting on quite large amounts of irrigation, we didn't actually see a lot of losses. So we only saw 5 kg lost, sort of less than 10%. Whereas at Camden, we actually saw quite a little bit more loss at the beginning, but actually a lot more losses over the subsequent grazing cycles. And so once again, even though it's in the soil, it's not in the soil in a sort of stable form. It hasn't been immobilised in the microbial biomass. And it's also why the sort of enhanced efficiency fertilisers don't really work so well in that soil because we just can't hold on to it. Our losses are actually higher. This is a bit of a busy slide, but I'll try and skip through it. So, one of the key questions here is, we're putting on fertiliser 12 times a year, or up to 12 times a year, depending on the system. So we have a lot of different climatic conditions, different growth periods there. do we just stick with a set recipe, just 40 kg every single month, or do we try and adjust that, based on the season? So even though these are irrigated systems, irrigation's almost supplementary, I suppose, because it's very hard. They still do struggle to try and get as much irrigation on as they can for optimal conditions. And Marguerite's working on a subsequent project called, was it More Profit from Irrigation or something?
Smarter irrigation.
There you go. Yeah, so irrigation's, even though they're irrigated, it's supplementary irrigation, even though they're still putting on sort of 80 millimetres every couple of weeks or so. So here we have 3 different responses over the same season to applied nitrogen, and that's really just driven around, plant growth, grazing period, temperatures, and obviously rainfall. So it is irrigated, but the more water you have in the soil, the better you grow grass. So we just then looked at a few of the different, NUE metrics. The main thing I wanted to show at this point is this last one down the bottom right-hand corner around profit, and using some very simple assumptions that, we have 100% utilisation rate, the cows are actually eating all the grass, which is a big assumption. We can basically do some economic figures on that. And I'll compare that to an enhanced efficiency fertiliser later on, which is why I want to show that. But obviously, as you can see, depending on your nitrogen response and getting that seasonal response right, we can have quite a big change in our profit. Are we putting nitrogen on that's just being wasted or not being utilised, or is it potentially staying in the soil and having carryover into the next season? And this is basically looking at the enhanced efficiency fertiliser product, and this is mainly at Casino. We actually didn't see any impact at the Camden site, as I mentioned. And this is the DMPP product, so the NTech product. And we actually did see quite a substantial result, increase in yield, and similar to what I think Lucas showed, that stuff from Terry Rose, looking at the end response, and we're not just looking at end rate, we're looking at the cross rates, and we basically see the maximum benefit where we basically optimising our growth. Different across seasons. In Kikuyu, in the summer response, we did see it. It didn't optimise out so much, and that was just because of the differences in grazing cycle there. It was a shorter rotation. But we see a clear benefit to it in the ryegrass. But interestingly, because it sort of dies off so much, so at the really high rates, the yield benefits we see is just not there, and that's just because the plants are taking up as much nitrogen as they can. They're now short of water or phosphorus or something else. But what that means, if we come back to our profit graph, back down the bottom left-hand side here, both the profit and the marginal profit, so the profit per additional unit of nitrogen, drop off much faster with the DMPP product because it costs more, and you're not getting that additional benefit if you go over a certain rate. If you're putting on too much of that product, your profitability really gets dives. So if you get that wrong, if you hit that sweet spot, it's great. You're making it is profitable, but if you sort of go above that sweet spot of around, in this case, 30 kilograms per hectare per application, your profitability nosedives pretty quick. So it's getting that rate right, and it's about the rule of thumb of about 20% reduction to the typical urea rate holds pretty well true in this case. That it is profitable, but if you sort of get the rate wrong, the profitability declines pretty quickly. We have, I suppose, a couple of different data streams pointing to the DMPP product working, and one of them is this immobilisation. So this is actually done from a 15N study from Johannes. Using the DMPP product, we basically saw a 3.9-fold reduction in N2 using the DMPP, but we also saw up to 73% increase in immobilisation. So we do see that increase in immobilisation using that product. And you can see this graph here, we're basically looking at the DMPP in the blue, this is N2 losses again, and urea in the red. So you can see there's quite a substantial reduction in losses, and this is over one of these big East Coast low events. And this is why we're seeing this yield benefit from the DMPP. And we also see that in our annual recoveries. It's a bit of a messy graph, but basically take-home message is we lost 45 kilograms of nitrogen compared to 120 using the DMPP at a lower rate compared to 120 kilos of urea with the same yields. So we can actually reduce our rate using the DMPP and reduce our losses, and that's basically translating also into improved yields, which is good. Talking about the timing then, so how do we bring all this together? We basically got the timing, interaction with rainfall events, and basically how we adjust our fertiliser accordingly. We have low potential losses, and this is actually looking at nitrogen demand. So this is when our plant, it's a balance between plant uptake and soil supply of nitrogen. So if we're getting lots of mineralisation going on, we have low plant demand because the soil is providing it all. In this case, we're basically looking at the difference here. So we actually have maximum growth in the spring, and we also have relatively low mineralisation because we have low soil temperatures and it's not too wet. So this is when we've got most of our nitrogen demand. So we want to be putting on, we can actually increase our fertiliser rate then. If you're coming into summer, it's a bit more patchy depending on the season. But basically, we still have the plant demand, but now the mineralisation's kicking off and it's supplying a lot of nitrogen. So actually, we don't need so much nitrogen. And also coming into the autumn, and this is a bit of a, I suppose, still one of the more unknown ones, but in this case, we still got, because we planted the ryegrass over the top of the kikuyu, we basically tried to stop the kikuyu growing either by killing it with Roundup or hammering it pretty hard. And we're trying to get the ryegrass established. The ryegrass is only sort of yay big, not a lot of plant demand there. And so we could probably look at reducing our fertiliser application rates there as well. So understanding, when are our key growth periods, when can we increase our nitrogen application, and when can we reduce it is important. So take-home messages, basically we found we could do very little with irrigation if it's done right. So if if irrigation replaces ET, evapotranspiration, then irrigation, how much you put on, the timing of it makes very little difference. If we put on 20 mils or if we put on 90 millimetres, it doesn't make a lot of difference to losses or to yields. Where our big losses comes from these rainfall events, which we have this pulsing effect. And that's where we get these massive denitrification peaks, or where it's waterlogged for more than 2 days. So you sort of get this combination effect. And unfortunately, with this part of the world, our climate systems seem to be moving later and later. So we're getting a lot more rain in the autumn now, which is also corresponding to this establishment period for the ryegrass. And so you're sort of teeing up a period where there's traditionally low plant demand with lots of East Coast lows. And so you sort of got this worst of both worlds coinciding. So mineralisation during the summer can supply most of the nitrogen requirements, but we can certainly increase our nitrogen inputs during the spring ryegrass season. The ryegrass just sort of has an infinite capacity to take up nitrogen, but we need to be aware, particularly in annual ryegrass, of nitrates in the leaf. EEFs are variable. We did some urease studies, volatilisation, and we just found that under normal conditions, like if you're following the normal farmer procedure in this region, there's not a lot of potential for losses, but certainly the DMPP increases losses and can basically increase yields as well, but only if you get them at a reduced rate to be profitable. Next steps, I suppose, we've done some work with the drones, like everyone, and there's some potential big wins there, both around mapping nitrous oxide, urine patches particularly, but also trying to predict plant uptake of nitrogen. Some papers we put out, so we also work collaboratively with a group out of New Zealand, Tim Clough, and those guys, so we published a couple of those papers there as well. A fair bit done by Johannes here, which is great. We've also, obviously, as Kath mentioned, updated the guidelines, and there's also a YouTube series done with local land services with Peter Beale, so that's available online. Did a nice little schematic about wetting and drying cycles, which is probably also relevant to the sugarcane industry, I suppose, with this pumping of these systems. And that's it.